He was a hardened, solitary rancher who swore he didn't need a wife. But when corrupt land barons tried to frame the woman working in his cookhouse, he did the unthinkable. He handed over his entire life savings and violently broke her heart just to buy her freedom. He thought he was saving her, but he underestimated the stubbornness of an Eastern girl. She didn't run away. She stayed to fight for him. Today we learn that real strength isn't just about wielding a gun. It's having the courage to stay and fight for the people who anchor your soul. Welcome to our channel, where the spirit of the Old West comes alive through stories of cowboy romance. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like, drop a comment, share it with fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to ride along with us on our next adventure.
Tick, tick, tick. The rhythmic metallic heartbeat of the silver pocket watch was the only thing holding Eleanor Vance together. She gripped the cold metal in her palm so tightly the engraved backing bit into her skin. Beneath the soot-stained window of the Union Pacific rail car, the sweeping plains of Wyoming rushed past in a blur of dead yellow grass and harsh, unyielding earth. Tick, tick, tick. The watch was a masterpiece of brass gears and coiled springs, built by her father's own hands. Now it was all she had left of him. That and the threadbare dark blue wool dress clinging to her exhausted frame. A sudden deafening shriek from the train's steam whistle violently severed the quiet ticking. The massive iron beast ground its brakes against the tracks, sending a shudder through the floorboards that rattled Eleanor's teeth. Steam hissed into the dry, suffocating air as the conductor shouted the arrival. Laramie, Wyoming. The end of the line, the beginning of her new life, Eleanor took a slow, measured breath, tasting coal dust and anticipation. She carefully tucked the pocket watch into her bodice, letting it rest heavy against her heart, and gathered her worn carpet bag. She had spent her last 3 dimes in Chicago for a stale loaf of bread. Her purse was entirely empty. There was no safety net, no return ticket, and no home waiting for her in Boston. There was only Silas Montgomery. Through the train window, the depot was a chaotic swarm of moving bodies. Cattlemen in dusty dusters, merchants barking orders, and women lifting the hems of their calico dresses to avoid the horse manure baking in the afternoon sun. It was raw, loud, and entirely alien to the quiet, methodical world of her father's watchmaking shop. Stepping down from the rail car, her boots hit the wooden platform with a dull thud. The wind immediately whipped at her skirts, carrying the sharp scent of dry pine and livestock. She scanned the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas had sent her a photograph 3 months ago. A handsome man with neatly parted hair, a tailored suit, and a warm smile. His letters had been her lifeline as the bank seized her father's shop, step by agonizing step. "Come west, my dear Eleanor," he had written. "I have built a prosperous life here. All it lacks is a woman of your grace to share it." "Miss Vance?" Eleanor turned, her breath catching. Silas Montgomery stood a few yards away. It was him, the same sharp jawline and perfectly parted hair from the photograph. But the warm smile was entirely absent. His eyes, a pale, flat blue, dragged over her travel-stained wool dress, the dark circles under her eyes, and the scuffed leather of her carpet bag. He didn't step forward to take her bag. He didn't remove his hat. He simply stared at her with a look of cold, calculating apathy. "Mr. Montgomery," Eleanor managed, forcing a polite, hopeful smile. "I've arrived just as you arranged." Silas didn't answer. Instead, a second man stepped out from behind him. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting tweed suit and carried a leather ledger under his arm. His face was slick with sweat despite the dry wind. "Eleanor Vance?" the man asked, his voice nasal and loud enough to draw the attention of the passing crowd. "Yes?" Eleanor's smile faltered. The instinctual panic of a cornered animal began to prickle at the base of her neck. "I am Arthur Vance, legal counsel representing Mr. Montgomery," the man declared, snapping the ledger open. He pulled a folded sheet of heavy parchment from the pages and shoved it toward her. "You are hereby served with a formal declaration of debt and fraud." Eleanor stared at the paper, then at Silas. The noise of the station seemed to fade into a dull roar in her ears. What? Silas, I don't understand. Don't play the fool, Miss Vance, Silas said, his voice carrying the sharp ring of practiced indignation. Several onlookers slowed their pace, their eyes darting toward the confrontation. I received a telegram from a Boston bank 2 days ago. They informed me of the massive debts your late father left behind, debts you conveniently failed to mention in your letters. My father's debts were settled, Eleanor said, her voice shaking but her spine going rigid. The bank took the shop. They took the house. I left Boston with nothing but the clothes on my back. I hid nothing from you. A lie, Silas countered smoothly, playing entirely to the gathering crowd. You came here hoping to trick me into a marriage of convenience, so I would be legally bound to pay your Eastern creditors. You are a grifter, Miss Vance, and I will not be made a fool of. That is a fabrication. Eleanor stepped forward, her polite veneer cracking. You sent for me. You promised. I promised a home to an honest woman, Silas interrupted, taking a deliberate step back as if her very proximity offended him. Not a desperate beggar looking for a deep pocket. Our arrangement is terminated. Do not attempt to contact me again, or I will have the sheriff arrest you for attempted fraud. He didn't wait for her response. He simply turned on his heel and walked away, his lawyer scurrying after him like a well-trained dog. Eleanor stood frozen on the wooden platform. The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly on her shoulders, but she felt entirely numb. The crowd of onlookers lingered for a moment, whispering behind gloved hands and tipping their brims down to avoid her gaze before scattering. In a matter of seconds, she had been rendered destitute, humiliated, and socially exiled. "Hey, lady!" A gruff voice broke through the ringing in her ears. A burly baggage handler stood beside the train car, holding her heavy wooden trunk. "You gonna pay for the haul or what?" "2 bits. Eleanor swallowed the lump of ash in her throat. I don't have it." The handler scowled. With a careless grunt, he dropped the trunk onto the platform. The impact popped the worn brass latch. The lid jerked open, spilling a few modest folded linens onto the dusty wood. Laughter drifted from a couple of cowboys leaning against the depot wall. Eleanor's vision blurred, a hot, stinging pressure building behind her eyes. But the pocket watch ticked against her chest. Tick, tick, tick. Precision. Control. She squeezed her eyes shut, forced the tears back, and dropped to her knees on the dirty platform to repack her linens. She would not weep. Not here. Not for Silas Montgomery, and not for the amusement of strangers. A shadow fell over her. It was large enough to block out the harsh afternoon sun entirely. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over a folded petticoat. She looked up, tracing a pair of dust-caked leather boots, worn denim trousers, and a heavy canvas duster that looked like it had survived a war. The man standing over her was tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing, carrying the kind of quiet, dangerous stillness that made the surrounding crowd instinctively give him a wide berth. A Stetson hat was pulled low over his brow, casting his face in shadow. He smelled of horse sweat, sun-baked leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a silver dollar, and flicked it through the air. The coin caught the sunlight before landing perfectly in the baggage handler's hands. "Put her trunk in the wagon," the man ordered. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that brokered absolutely no argument. The handler blinked, looked at the silver dollar, and scrambled to obey. Eleanor stood up quickly, clutching her carpetbag to her chest like a shield. She finally saw the man's face. It was a face carved from the harsh landscape around them. Hard angles, a shadowed jawline, and a faint, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Fresh blood oozed from a newly split lip, suggesting he had recently concluded a violent disagreement in one of the nearby saloons. His eyes, a piercing, stormy gray, locked onto hers. "I don't need your charity, mister," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Good," the man replied flatly, "because I don't have any to give." He didn't offer a polite smile. He didn't doff his hat. He looked her up and down with an unreadable, purely pragmatic assessment. "Name's Caleb Thorne," he said. "I run the Blackwood Ranch, 30 miles north of here. I got 10 hands who eat like starved wolves, a ledger book that looks like it was written in blindfold, and a kitchen covered in an inch of grease. I need someone to keep my numbers straight and my men fed." Eleanor stared at him, bewildered. You want to hire me?" "I saw what just happened," Caleb said, his gaze drifting toward the street where Silas had disappeared before snapping back to her. "I know you're flat broke. I know you got nowhere to go. And I know you didn't cry when that bastard threw you to the wolves." He stepped closer. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. Yet strangely, Eleanor didn't feel the urge to retreat. "I don't want a wife," Caleb said, his tone blunt and devoid of romance. "And I don't harbor weeping city girls. I offer 6 months of hard labor. You cook, you clean, you manage the books. In exchange, you get a roof, 3 meals a day, and enough wages to buy a ticket back east when the snow thaws." He glanced down at her soft, pale hands clutching the carpetbag. "It's dirty, exhausting work," Caleb finished, his stormy eyes meeting hers. "If you aren't afraid of calluses, get in the wagon." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked toward a battered buckboard wagon hitched to 2 massive draft horses. Eleanor stood alone on the platform. The Wyoming wind howled around her, biting and cold. She could stay here penniless, waiting for the sheriff to arrest her on Silas's false charges. Or she could follow a bleeding, scarred stranger into the wilderness to do the backbreaking labor of a ranch servant. Tick, tick, tick. Eleanor lifted her chin, squared her shoulders in her stifling wool dress, and marched toward the wagon. The buckboard wagon slammed into another rut, jarring Eleanor's teeth so hard she tasted copper. She gripped the edge of the wooden bench, her knuckles white beneath her threadbare gloves, as a cloud of pale Wyoming dust washed over them. Beside her, Caleb Thorne handled the reins of the massive draft horses with an effortless, fluid strength. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the city limits of Laramie 2 hours ago. The silence stretching between them was as vast and unforgiving as the landscape, a sprawling ocean of sagebrush, jagged rock formations, and a sky so violently blue it made her eyes ache. Eleanor pressed her hand to her bodice. Tick, tick, tick. The faint vibration of her father's pocket watch grounded her against the terrifying reality of what she had just done. She was riding into the wilderness with a scarred stranger, leaving the ruins of her life behind. "The terms are simple," Caleb said suddenly. His deep, gravelly voice startled her, cutting through the howling wind. He didn't turn his head, keeping his storm-gray eyes fixed on the horizon. "You're up at 4. The men eat at 5, noon, and sundown. You keep the ledger, order the provisions when the supply wagon comes through, and keep the cookhouse from burning down. You don't interfere with the cattle, and the men won't interfere with you." "Understood," Eleanor said, pitching her voice to carry over the rattling wagon wheels. 6 months, Caleb continued, shifting the leather reins in his large, calloused hands. "For that, you get $30 a month. When the spring thaw opens the passes, I buy you a first-class ticket back to Boston. You walk away with enough seed money to start over, and we never see each other again. Is that clear, Miss Vance?" It was a transaction. Cold, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of the flowery, deceitful prose Silas Montgomery had used to lure her here. Strangely, Eleanor found it immensely comforting. "It is perfectly clear, Mr. Thorne," she replied, lifting her chin. "And you will find I earn every penny of my wages." Caleb finally glanced at her. His gaze dropped to her hands, still tightly gripping the wooden bench. "We'll see." Dusk was bleeding the sky into bruised shades of purple and burnt orange when Blackwood Ranch finally materialized from the shadows. There were no white picket fences or manicured lawns. It was a fortress of survival, a sprawling, weathered barn, a cluster of sturdy bunkhouses, and a main cabin built from thick, rough-hewn timber. But what dominated the property was the windmill. It was a towering skeletal structure of iron and wood, standing like a giant sentinel against the darkening sky. The massive metal blades turned sluggishly in the evening breeze, emitting a low, rhythmic groan that resonated in Eleanor's chest. "Deepwater well," Caleb said, noticing her staring. "Only reliable water for 20 miles in any direction. It keeps us alive." He pulled the wagon to a halt near the main cabin. Before Eleanor could attempt to climb down, a grizzled man with a pronounced limp emerged from the barn carrying a lantern. He had a face like tanned leather and a thick silver mustache. "Boss," the older man greeted, his eyes darting to Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "Tom," Caleb acknowledged, stepping down from the wagon. He reached into the back and hoisted Eleanor's trunk onto his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. "This is Miss Vance. She's taking over the cookhouse and the books. Treat her with the same respect you'd give my ghost, or pack your bedroll." Tom immediately pulled off his battered hat, revealing a bald, sun-spotted head. "Yes, sir. Welcome to Blackwood, ma'am. I'm Tom Higgins, the foreman." "Thank you, Mr. Higgins," Eleanor said, fighting the stiffness in her legs as she climbed down. Caleb led her to a side door of the main cabin, pushing it open with his boot. "The cookhouse." Eleanor stepped inside, and her heart sank. The room was large, but it was a disaster of bachelor neglect. Stacks of crusted tin plates teetered on a grease-stained wooden table. Sacks of flour and beans were haphazardly piled in a corner, and dominating the back wall was a monstrous black cast-iron Acme range. It looked less like a stove, and more like a sleeping, soot-covered dragon. "Your room is through there," Caleb said, nodding toward a small, adjacent door. He set her trunk down with a heavy thud. "Breakfast is at 5. He didn't wish her a good night. He simply turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the cold, grease-scented gloom. At 4 in the morning, the Wyoming cold was a physical entity, biting through the thin soles of her boots and sinking deep into her bones. Eleanor stood at the well outside the cookhouse, shivering violently in the pre-dawn darkness. The wooden bucket was heavy, but the rope was worse. It was thick, stiff hemp, coarse as wire brush. As she hauled the water up hand over hand, the rough fibers bit mercilessly into her soft, city-bred skin. By the third bucket, 2 blisters on her right palm had already torn open, weeping clear fluid and blood. She bit her lip, suppressing a whimper, and carried the sloshing buckets inside. The stove was her next enemy. In her father's house, they had a small, polite coal parlor stove. This iron beast required heavy split logs. She struggled to lift the massive cast-iron skillet, her wrists trembling under its weight. When she tried to regulate the heat by adjusting the dampers, she pulled the wrong lever. A thick plume of acrid black smoke immediately belched into her face, stinging her eyes and coating the back of her throat in soot. Coughing violently, she blindly grabbed a towel to fan the smoke away, but the damage was done. By the time the heavy boots of the ranch hands stomped onto the porch at 5 o'clock, the cookhouse was a hazy, smoke-filled disaster. 10 men filed in, bringing the smell of livestock and frost with them. They stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the table. Sitting on a cracked platter was a mound of biscuits, charred completely black on the bottom. Beside them lay strips of bacon, oscillating between burnt to a crisp and worryingly translucent, swimming in a pool of lukewarm grease. Eleanor stood by the stove, her face smeared with soot, her hair escaping its neat pins, and her hands throbbing with agonizing raw pain. The urge to flee to her small room and weep into her pillow was nearly overwhelming. Caleb walked in last. He took off his hat, his storm-gray eyes scanning the smoky room, the ruined food, and finally, Eleanor's defeated posture. He didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes or make a snide comment about Eastern women. He simply pulled out a chair at the head of the table and sat down. "Sit," Caleb ordered his men. They scrambled to obey. Tom Higgins reached out, took a blackened biscuit, and used a hunting knife to scrape the worst of the charcoal onto the table. He took a bite, chewed methodically with a stoic expression, and swallowed hard. "Coffee's strong, ma'am," Tom said, tipping his head to her politely. "Wakes a man right up. Keeps the blood moving." It was a terribly kind lie. The coffee was practically sludge. They ate the terrible meal in silence. Eleanor watched them from the corner, her cheeks burning with hot, agonizing humiliation. She had promised to earn her keep. She had promised she wasn't a weeping city girl, and she had failed spectacularly on her very first morning. By nightfall, the cookhouse was finally clean. The mountain of dishes had been scrubbed, the floor swept, and the iron dragon of a stove wrestled into a low, banking simmer. Eleanor sat alone at the wooden table, the only light coming from a single kerosene lamp. Her pocket watch lay open on the table before her, its precise, rhythmic ticking the only sound in the quiet cabin. Tick, tick, tick. She placed her hands flat on the table, palms up. They were a ruined mess, red, swollen, and decorated with burst blisters and minor burns from the cast-iron skillet. Her muscles ached so deeply she felt as though she had been beaten. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Eleanor jumped, hastily trying to pull her hands under the table, but she wasn't fast enough. Caleb stepped inside. He had washed away the dust of the day, his dark hair damp, though he still wore his heavy denim trousers and a faded Henley shirt that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He carried a bundle of wood under one arm. He didn't say a word as he walked to the stove, dropping the wood into the bin. Eleanor noticed that the logs weren't the thick, heavy chunks from the main pile outside. They were split small, thin, manageable pieces of kindling that wouldn't require a heavy axe or massive strain to lift. Caleb turned, his eyes dropping to the table. He saw her pocket watch, the intricate brass gears exposed beneath the glass, and he saw her ruined, trembling hands. He didn't offer pity. He didn't ask if she was all right. Instead, his gaze shifted to the heavy, wooden-handled butcher knife resting on the cutting block, the one she had struggled to grip all day to slice the salt pork. He walked over, picked up the heavy knife, and pulled out the chair opposite her at the table. Sitting down, Caleb drew a sharp, folding hunting knife from his belt. In the warm, golden glow of the kerosene lamp, he began to whittle. The sound of sharp steel shaving away hard wood filled the quiet room, harmonizing with the ticking of the watch. Caleb's hands were massive, scarred, and rough, but his movements were incredibly precise. He shaved the thick, cumbersome handle of the butcher knife down, smoothing the edges, narrowing the grip. Eleanor watched him, mesmerized. The silence between them wasn't cold like it had been on the wagon. It was heavy, charged. After 10 minutes, Caleb wiped the sawdust from the handle. He flipped the knife, offering it to her handle first across the table. Hesitantly, Eleanor reached out with her raw, aching hand. She wrapped her fingers around the wood. It fit her palm perfectly. The grip was narrow enough that she wouldn't have to strain her wrist and the smoothed edges wouldn't bite into her blisters. She looked up. Caleb was watching her intently, the flickering lamplight throwing the jagged scar on his brow into sharp relief. "The wind changes direction around 3 in the morning, Caleb said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "It creates a downdraft in the chimney. Keep the right damper closed until the sun comes up, or the stove will smoke." He didn't tell her she had failed. He was giving her the instructions to succeed. Eleanor swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the custom-carved handle of the knife. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Caleb stood, folding his hunting knife and slipping it back into his belt. For a brief second, his eyes lingered on her, softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the hardened armor of the rancher. "Get some sleep, Eleanor," he murmured. He walked out into the cold Wyoming night, leaving her alone with the ticking watch and a perfectly carved knife. And for the first time since she had stepped off the train, Eleanor didn't feel like the world was collapsing. She felt like she was learning how to rebuild it. Tick, tick, tick. 3 weeks later, the cookhouse was no longer a disaster zone. It was a machine. Eleanor Vance had approached the grueling reality of Blackwood Ranch the only way she knew how, like a watchmaker. Where others saw a chaotic, impossible mountain of chores, she saw gears, springs, and cogs. Everything required a sequence. Everything demanded calibration. She learned that the heavy iron pump out back required exactly 14 downward thrusts before it drew water. She discovered that the stubborn Acme stove needed a mix of slow-burning oak and fast-burning pine to maintain a steady baking temperature. She timed the rising of her sourdough starter by the position of the sun casting shadows across the scarred floorboards. By her 21st day on the ranch, the men no longer braced themselves before sitting at the long wooden table. At precisely 5 o'clock in the morning, Tom Higgins walked in, pulled off his hat, and stared at the platter in the center of the table. A towering stack of golden flaky biscuits sat beside a massive skillet of perfectly rendered bacon and a pot of steaming dark coffee that no longer resembled sludge. Eleanor stood by the stove, a flour-dusted apron tied over her wool dress, using her custom-whittled knife to slice a block of hard cheese. Tom took a bite of a biscuit, chewed slowly, and closed his eyes. He didn't say a word, but as he reached for a second one, he gave Eleanor a single, deeply respectful nod. It was the highest praise a Wyoming ranch foreman could offer. The blistering pain in Eleanor's hands had finally faded, replaced by rough, hardened calluses at the base of her fingers and along her palms. Her skin was losing its pale Boston sallowness, catching a subtle, sun-kissed warmth from her daily trips to the well and the root cellar. She was exhausted, her shoulders aching with a persistent, dull throb every night. But for the first time in her life, she felt a profound sense of ownership over her own survival. By mid-morning, the breakfast dishes were scrubbed, and the noon stew was simmering low on the stove. Wiping her brow with the back of her wrist, Eleanor stepped out onto the back porch to escape the stifling heat of the kitchen. The Wyoming air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of sage and dry earth. She unpinned the top button of her collar, letting the breeze cool her damp skin, and leaned against the wooden railing. Down in the circular breaking corral, a cloud of dust billowed into the bright blue sky. Eleanor paused, her eyes drawn to the movement. Caleb Thorne was inside the ring with a wild roan mustang. The horse was a creature of pure, terrified fury, its eyes rolling white, its coat lathered in sweat, hooves striking the hard-packed dirt with the sound of pistol shots. Eleanor's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the porch rail, fully expecting Caleb to raise a whip or shout, to break the animal with the brutal force she had seen teamsters use in the city. But Caleb did none of those things. He stood perfectly still in the center of the corral, holding a coiled lariat. He wasn't fighting the Mustang, he was anchoring it. When the horse reared, striking the air with lethal front hooves, Caleb simply gave it slack, stepping smoothly out of range with a fluid, athletic grace that belied his massive size. He kept his posture relaxed, his shoulders down. "Easy," Caleb's voice drifted across the yard. It was a low, steady rumble, stripped of any anger or fear. "You're all right. Easy now." Eleanor watched, mesmerized. The sheer physical power radiating from Caleb was undeniable. The muscles in his back and shoulders strained against his sweat-dampened shirt as he held his ground against 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle. Yet his control was absolute. He wasn't dominating the horse through pain, he was communicating with it. He was establishing a boundary of quiet, immovable authority. It took nearly an hour. Eleanor didn't move from the porch. She watched as the Mustang's frantic circles gradually slowed. The wild rearing turned into nervous trotting, then a cautious, heavy-breathing walk. Finally, Caleb stepped forward. He didn't reach for the horse immediately. He just stood there, offering his presence, until the roan took a hesitant step toward him, lowering its massive head to sniff Caleb's outstretched, scarred hand. Eleanor felt a strange, sudden flutter low in her stomach. A sharp, unfamiliar heat bloomed in her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. In Boston, Silas Montgomery had worn tailored suits and spoken of investments and society dinners. He had seemed like a giant to her then. Now, watching Caleb stroke the neck of the tamed Mustang, Silas looked like a little boy playing dress-up. Caleb was a man forged by the earth itself. Dangerous, yes, but possessed of a profound, protective gentleness that shook Eleanor to her core. Caleb patted the horse's neck one last time, unlatched the corral gate, and handed the lid rope to a waiting ranch hand. He pulled off his Stetson, wiping a forearm across his sweat-soaked brow, and turned toward the water pump near the cookhouse. He stopped when he saw Eleanor standing on the porch. For a long moment, the distance between them seemed to evaporate, leaving only the charged, dusty air. Caleb's chest heaved with exertion, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers. He didn't look away, and neither did she. Swallowing hard, Eleanor grabbed a clean tin cup from the porch shelf and walked down the wooden steps to meet him at the iron pump. "You've been standing there a while," Caleb noted, his voice raspy from the dust. He stopped a few feet from her. He smelled intensely of leather, horse sweat, and pure, raw exertion. "I was watching," Eleanor said honestly. She stepped up to the pump, grabbing the heavy iron handle. "I expected you to force it." "Force breaks the spirit," Caleb replied quietly, stepping closer to wash the dust from his hands. "You break a horse's spirit, you ruin it. You just have to show them that they're safe and that you won't yield. The rest is just patience." Eleanor paused, her hand resting on the iron lever. The parallel hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You show them they're safe and that you won't yield." It was exactly how he had treated her since the day at the train station. She pushed the pump handle down, but the heavy iron was stubborn today, resisting her initial push. Before she could adjust her grip, Caleb's large, calloused hand closed over hers on the handle. Eleanor gasped softly. The sudden contact was electric. His hand was blazing hot, rough as sandpaper, and completely engulfed hers. For a fraction of a second, neither of them pushed the handle. They just stood there, hands layered over iron, separated by mere inches. Caleb looked down at her hand beneath his. His thumb brushed lightly over the hardened ridge of skin at the base of her fingers. "Calluses," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "I told you," Eleanor whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I wasn't afraid of them." Caleb's eyes flicked up to her face. The intensity in his gaze was staggering, a heavy, simmering heat that stripped away the cold pragmatism of their 6-month agreement. He saw the soot smudged on her cheek, the stray tendrils of hair escaping her pins, and the fierce, unyielding pride in her eyes. A faint, incredibly rare smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I see that, Eleanor," he said softly. He didn't pull away immediately. He pushed the handle down with her, the muscles in his arm flexing against hers, until the cold, clear water gushed from the iron spout into the wooden trough. Only then did he release her hand, taking the tin cup she offered, his fingers brushing hers just long enough to send another jolt of warmth up her arm. He drank the water in long, thirsty swallows, his Adam's apple bobbing. When he finished, he handed the cup back. "The men are eating better than they have in 5 years, Caleb said, wiping a drop of water from his chin with his thumb. "Tom says you run that cookhouse like a Swiss watch." "It's just mechanics, Mr. Thorne. Everything has a rhythm." "Caleb," he corrected quietly, his eyes holding hers. "If you're going to feed me, you might as well use my name." Eleanor's breath hitched again. "Caleb." He nodded once, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement, before settling his Stetson back on his head, casting his eyes into shadow once more. "I'll see you at supper." Eleanor watched his broad back as he walked toward the barn, her hand still tingling where he had touched it. The mechanical, predictable rhythm of her watchmaker's life had successfully tamed the cookhouse. But as she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the frantic, entirely erratic beating of her own heart, she realized there were some things she could not control. The 6 months she had agreed to suddenly felt entirely too short, and the Wyoming frontier, once a terrifying trap, was beginning to feel dangerously like home. By late August, the Wyoming sun was no longer merely hot. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the valley with a suffocating, merciless pressure. The creeks had dried to cracked, jagged mud, and the prairie grass had turned the color of old parchment. Dust coated everything. A fine, alkaline powder that settled on the windowsills, coated the horse's flanks, and gritted between Eleanor's teeth no matter how much water she drank. Through the sweltering, breathless heat, only one sound mattered at Blackwood Ranch. Clack, groan, clack, groan, clack, groan. The massive iron windmill towering behind the main cabin was the heartbeat of the property. Its wide blades caught the sparse, hot thermals, turning the heavy gears that drove the pump rod hundreds of feet into the earth, drawing up the sweet, icy water from the subterranean river below. It fed the troughs. It kept the herd of 2,000 cattle alive. It was the only reason Blackwood hadn't turned into a graveyard. Eleanor wiped a bead of sweat from her temple with the back of a flour-dusted wrist. She stepped out onto the porch carrying a heavy wooden pail sloshing with cool water and a tin dipper. Down in the yard, Caleb and Tom were repairing a broken wagon axle. The heat radiating off the baked earth was visible, shimmering in wavy lines, but neither man had stopped working since dawn. Caleb's denim shirt was soaked through, clinging to the heavy musculature of his back as he hoisted the wagon's corner, his jaw locked in concentration while Tom slid the new axle beam into place. "Water?" Eleanor called out, her voice slightly raspy. Caleb lowered the wagon frame onto the block with a heavy thud. He straightened up, rolling his broad shoulders to ease the tension, and walked toward the porch. The sheer physical endurance of the man never failed to astound her. He took off his Stetson, running a hand through his damp, dark hair, and accepted the tin dipper she offered. "Thank you," he murmured, drinking it down in 3 long swallows. Before he could hand it back, a low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Caleb froze. His storm-gray eyes snapped toward the eastern horizon, narrowing against the blinding glare. A dense cloud of pale dust was rising on the trail, moving fast. Tom limped over, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He squinted at the approaching riders. "Company. And they ain't riding casual." Caleb's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The relaxed, exhausted rancher vanished, replaced by a coiled, dangerous tension. He dropped the dipper back into the pail and stepped off the porch, his hand falling casually, but deliberately, to rest on the worn leather holster strapped to his thigh. "Go inside, Eleanor," Caleb said softly, not looking back at her. Eleanor didn't move. She stood on the top step, her hands gripping the wooden railing. "Who is it?" "Harlan Croft," Tom muttered, spitting into the dust. "The devil himself coming to collect his due." 4 riders broke through the heat haze, pulling their sleek, expensive Morgans to a halt in the center of the yard. The 2 men in the rear were clearly hired guns wearing dusters that failed to conceal the repeating rifles resting across their saddles. But it was the 2 men in the front who commanded the air. The older man, Harlan Croft, sat tall in the saddle. He wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray, looking absurdly pristine despite the dust. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his eyes were flat, assessing, and utterly devoid of warmth. Beside him was his son, Jasper, a younger, sharper version of his father, with a cruel twist to his mouth and the arrogant slouch of a man who believed the world owed him everything. "Caleb," Harlan greeted, his voice a smooth, cultured drawl that sounded entirely out of place in the dirt of Blackwood Yard. "Harlan," Caleb replied, his voice deadly quiet. He didn't invite them to dismount. "You're a long way from your property, and you're trespassing on mine." Harlan offered a thin, placating smile. "Just a neighborly visit. It's a brutal summer, Caleb. The drought is breaking backs from here to Cheyenne. I heard your northern pastures are burning up. My pastures are fine." "Pride is a dangerous thing for a poor man," Harlan sighed, adjusting his leather riding gloves. "I'm here to make you a generous offer. The valley is consolidating. I'm willing to buy Blackwood. I'll pay off your father's old debts and give you enough cash to ride out of Wyoming with your dignity intact." Blackwood isn't for sale, Caleb stated, his posture immovable. Not today, not tomorrow, not to you. Jasper sneered, his horse sidestepping nervously. You're a fool, Thorne. You've got a puddle of water keeping a bunch of rib-showing cattle alive. When that well runs dry, the bank will take this dust bowl and we'll buy it for pennies. My father is doing you a favor. Caleb's gaze shifted to the younger Croft. The air in the yard seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the blazing sun. The well runs deep, Jasper. Deeper than your father's pockets. Now turn your horses around. Jasper's face flushed with anger. He yanked on his horse's reins, his eyes sweeping the yard before landing on the porch. He spotted Eleanor standing in the shadows of the overhang. A nasty, knowing grin spread across his face. Well, well, Jasper mocked, his voice carrying clearly. I heard Silas Montgomery threw his eastern trash out at the Laramie station. Taking in strays now, Thorne? Or is she just keeping your bed warm while you pretend you're not going bankrupt? The reaction was instantaneous. Caleb didn't shout. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply took 3 long, terrifyingly fast strides forward, grabbing the bridle of Jasper's horse. With a violent, sheer exertion of upper body strength, Caleb wrenched the horse's head down, forcing the animal to its knees. Jasper yelped, tumbling out of the saddle and crashing hard into the choking dust at Caleb's boots. The 2 hired guns behind Harlan instantly leveled their rifles at Caleb's chest. Tom drew his revolver in a flash of silver, cocking the hammer. Click! The mechanical sound echoed like a thunderclap. Time stood still. Caleb didn't even look at the rifles pointed at his heart. He looked down at Jasper, who was scrambling backward in the dirt, his face pale with sudden stark terror. You ever speak about her again, Caleb whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, suppressed fury. And I will cut your tongue out and feed it to the coyotes. Do you understand me? Stand down, Harlan barked, though whether he was talking to his hired guns or Caleb was unclear. Harlan's polished veneer had cracked, his eyes flashing with real anger. Call off your dog, Caleb, or my men will drop you where you stand. They might, Caleb said, finally looking up at the older Croft, his hand resting inches from his colt. But my bullet goes through your skull before I hit the ground. You want to test the math, Harlan? Be my guest. Harlan stared at the scarred, unyielding rancher. He saw a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and everything to protect. Harlan raised a hand, signaling his men to lower their rifles. Get up, Jasper, Harlan spat at his son. Jasper scrambled to his feet, humiliated and coated in dust, yanking his horse up and hastily remounting. This isn't over, Thorne, Harlan said softly, the false neighborly charm completely gone. His eyes drifted from Caleb up to the towering iron windmill and back down again. Water is a fragile thing, a single mechanical failure, a single dry spell, and a man can lose everything he loves. It would be a terrible shame if your luck ran out. He yanked his reins, turning his Morgan around, and spurred it into a gallop. Jasper and the hired guns followed, leaving a massive, choking cloud of alkali dust in their wake. Caleb stood in the yard until the dust settled, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She watched Caleb turn and look at her. The lethal, terrifying violence that had just radiated from him was gone, replaced by a heavy, profound exhaustion. He walked slowly up the porch steps. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am fine," Eleanor said, though her heart was still racing. She looked at the trail where the Crofts had vanished. Who are they? Why did Silas Montgomery's name come up? Caleb leaned against a porch post, staring out at the windmill. Clack groan, clack groan. Harlan Croft owns half the county, Caleb explained quietly. He buys up the land around the water, diverts the creeks, and chokes out the small ranches until they're forced to sell. Silas Montgomery is Croft's lawyer. Silas writes the predatory loans, and Croft enforces them. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The man who had lured her west, who had nearly destroyed her, was working for the men trying to destroy Caleb. "Why hasn't he choked you out?" she asked. Caleb looked up at the turning iron blades. Because of that. My father dug this well by hand 20 years ago. He hit a subterranean river that never runs dry, not even in the worst drought. As long as that windmill turns, Blackwood survives. And as long as Blackwood survives, Croft can't control the valley. He turned his gaze to her, the storm gray of his eyes softening. I'm sorry Jasper spoke to you that way. You didn't deserve that. You defended my honor, Caleb, Eleanor said softly, stepping closer to him. But you risked your life to do it. You had 2 rifles pointed at your chest. Caleb looked down at her, the distance between them shrinking to mere inches. The heat of the afternoon seemed to press them together. There are some things worth taking a bullet for, Eleanor. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He held her gaze for a long, breathless moment before stepping past her into the cabin, leaving Eleanor staring at the towering windmill, the weight of his words echoing in her chest. That night, the heat refused to break. The air in Eleanor's small room was thick and stagnant. She lay on top of her thin quilt, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. On her small bedside table, her father's pocket watch ticked away the seconds. Tick, tick, tick. Outside, the familiar, comforting rhythm of the windmill lulled her toward sleep. Clack groan, clack groan, clack groan. It was the heartbeat of Caleb's legacy, the machine that kept them all alive. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic sounds wash over her. Then, at exactly 2 in the morning, the rhythm broke. It started with a horrific metallic screech that tore through the quiet night like a dying animal. The heavy vibration in the ground stuttered. Clang! Snap! The sound of thick iron shattering echoed across the ranch yard, followed by the heavy, terrifying thud of massive metal components crashing into the gears. And then, absolute, horrifying silence. The clack groan was gone. Eleanor bolted upright, her heart hammering in her throat. She threw her shawl over her shoulders and ran out of her room, through the dark cookhouse and out the back door. Lanterns were already flaring to life in the bunkhouses. Caleb was sprinting across the yard, wearing only his trousers and boots, a lit lantern in one hand, and his drawn revolver in the other. Tom Higgins was right behind him, carrying a Winchester rifle. Eleanor ran toward the base of the windmill. Caleb held the lantern high, illuminating the massive gearbox at the base of the tower. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was murder. A heavy rusted iron crowbar had been violently jammed directly into the primary drive gears. The sheer kinetic force of the turning blades had driven the crowbar deep into the mechanism, shearing off 4 massive iron teeth from the main cog and snapping the drive shaft clean in half. The machine was completely, utterly dead. Tom lowered his rifle, staring at the shattered iron with a look of pure despair. Lord Almighty, Croft's men. They must have snuck in on foot while we were asleep. Caleb stood perfectly still, the lantern light casting harsh, jagged shadows across his scarred face. His eyes were wide, staring at the ruined gears. The subterranean river was hundreds of feet down. Without the mechanical power of the windmill, there was no human way to draw enough water to sustain the herd. "Boss," Tom whispered, his voice cracking. "The tanks are only half full. In this heat, the herd, they'll be dead in 3 days." Caleb slowly lowered the lantern. The invincible, immovable man Eleanor had watched break a wild Mustang and stare down 2 rifles looked entirely broken. "I know," Caleb whispered into the dark, silent night. "We're finished." The silence was deafening. Dawn broke over Blackwood Ranch, not with the familiar rhythmic heartbeat of the windmill, but with the suffocating stillness of a graveyard. The sun crested the eastern ridges, an angry blood-red eye that promised another day of relentless 100-degree heat. The men stood in a loose semicircle around the base of the tower, their faces drawn and gray. The cattle were already restless in the distance, their low, parched lows drifting on the morning wind. "We have to sell," Tom Higgins said, his voice hollow. He stared at the shattered iron gearbox, kicking at the dust. "We drive 'em to the railhead in Laramie today. We'll take heavy losses, maybe get a quarter on the dollar from the meat packers. But if we wait until tomorrow, they'll be too weak to make the trek. We'll lose the whole herd." Caleb didn't answer. He stood with his hands resting on his hips, staring into the ruined mechanics of his father's legacy. The crowbar had done its job perfectly. The main drive shaft was severed. The primary gear looked like a mouthful of broken teeth. "Boss?" Tom prompted gently. "A machinist from Cheyenne takes 4 days to get here," Caleb said, his voice flat, stripped of all its usual commanding resonance. "And another week to cast a new shaft. We don't have a week. We don't have 3 days." He closed his eyes, the jagged scar on his brow pulling tight. "Saddle the horses, Tom. Get the men ready to drive the herd. We're done." "No, you aren't." The men turned. Eleanor walked out of the cookhouse. She wasn't wearing her apron. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, and over her shoulder she carried a heavy, rolled canvas bundle. She walked straight through the circle of defeated men and stopped at the base of the windmill. With a swift, practiced motion, she unrolled the canvas on a flat rock. It wasn't a bundle of kitchen knives. It was a watchmaker's tool roll, filled with precision wrenches, brass calipers, heavy files, and steel measuring gauges. Caleb opened his eyes, a frown creasing his forehead. "Eleanor, go back inside. It's going to be a rough day." "A gear is a gear, Caleb," Eleanor said, ignoring him. She stepped up onto the wooden platform, leaning into the greasy iron belly of the shattered gearbox. "Scale is just a matter of leverage." "It's cast iron, not a pocket watch," Caleb argued gently, stepping up behind her, wanting to pull her away from the wreckage of his life. "The main shaft is snapped clean in two. The primary cog is stripped." "I see that," Eleanor said, her eyes darting over the complex web of metal, tracing the lines of force and rotation. Her father's training kicked in, a cold, calculating logic overriding the frontier panic. "But the secondary pinion gear is intact, and the pump rod itself isn't bent." She turned to face him. They were standing inches apart on the narrow wooden platform. "We don't need to replace the primary gear," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "If we unbolt the mounting bracket, we can shift the entire housing back 2 inches. We bypass the broken teeth completely and mesh the secondary pinion directly to the pump crank." Tom stepped closer, squinting at the gears. "Ma'am, even if we shift it, what about the snapped shaft? It won't turn without a drive shaft." "We sleeve it," Eleanor said, turning her fierce gaze to Caleb. "Do you have any heavy steel piping, a piece of an old wagon axle, anything hollow and strong enough to slide over the brake?" Caleb stared at her. The defeat in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden desperate spark of hope. "I have a section of iron boiler pipe in the barn, thick gauge. We heat it in the forge until it expands, slide it over the snapped shaft, and drill it through to drop in steel locking pins," Eleanor instructed, her hands moving as she visualized the mechanics. "When the iron cools, it will shrink and bind the shaft together like a vise. It won't be pretty, and the blades will have to turn twice as fast to pump half the water because we're altering the gear ratio. But it will pump." The men exchanged stunned looks. Caleb looked at the gears, then down at the small, soot-smudged woman standing before him with her calipers and files. He didn't question her. He didn't ask if she was sure. "Tom!" Caleb barked, the absolute authority roaring back into his voice. "Fire up the forge! Get the heavy drills! The herd stays." By noon, the Blackwood yard was a blistering inferno. The heat inside the windmill's wooden framework was suffocating, compounded by the blazing forge nearby. Eleanor and Caleb were squeezed together in the tight, greasy scaffolding of the gearbox, 20 feet off the ground. Clang, clang, clang. Caleb swung a heavy sledgehammer, driving the red-hot iron sleeve over the broken drive shaft. Sweat poured off his face, soaking his shirt until it became a second skin. "Hold," Eleanor commanded. Caleb froze, his chest heaving, his muscles trembling from the sheer exertion. Eleanor leaned over him, her arm brushing his shoulder. She didn't flinch at the heat radiating from his skin or the grease staining her dress. She slid a set of brass calipers over the red-hot iron, measuring the alignment of the locking holes they had drilled. "A fraction of an inch to the left," she murmured, her face inches from his. She smelled of lye soap, dust, and raw determination. Caleb didn't use the hammer. He gripped the heavy iron wrench with both hands, his biceps bulging as he strained against the unyielding metal, forcing it to rotate just a hair. "There," Eleanor said. "Drop the pin." Caleb grabbed the steel locking pin with a pair of tongs and drove it through the aligned holes. It slid perfectly into place. They had been working like this for 5 hours, a brutal, intimate dance of her brilliant mind and his raw power. Where she lacked the brute strength to move the iron, he provided it. Where he lacked the mechanical precision to align the gears, she guided him. "Now, the housing," Eleanor said, wiping a streak of black grease across her forehead. They had to unbolt the massive secondary gear and physically heave it backward to mesh with the new setup. It weighed nearly 200 pounds. "Grab the pry bar," Caleb grunted, wedging his shoulder under the heavy iron cog. "When I lift, you lever the bracket into the new bolt holes." Eleanor jammed the heavy steel bar under the housing, throwing her entire body weight against it. Caleb roared, his boots slipping on the grease-slicked wood, the veins in his neck standing out like cords as he deadlifted the iron gear. "Push, Eleanor!" he strained. She gritted her teeth, her calloused hands screaming in protest as she drove the pry bar down. The heavy iron housing groaned, slid backward along the grease, and slammed into place. The teeth of the secondary gear meshed perfectly with the pump crank. They collapsed against the wooden railing, both gasping for air. Caleb turned his head, looking at her. Her hair was completely undone, falling in sweaty, tangled waves over her shoulders. Her face was smeared with black grease, her dress ruined. She had never looked more beautiful to him. He reached out, his massive grease-stained hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His thumb lingered on her jawline. The touch was entirely at odds with the brutal labor they had just performed. It was tender, reverent. "You're a hell of a watchmaker, Boston," Caleb whispered, his voice incredibly soft. Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked into his storm-gray eyes, seeing the absolute, unwavering respect burning there. The air between them felt thicker than the summer heat, charged with an undeniable magnetic pull. "Let's see if it ticks," she whispered back. Caleb gave her a slow, devastating smile. He turned and leaned over the railing. "Tom, release the brake!" Down in the yard, Tom threw his weight against the long wooden brake lever. High above, the massive iron blades of the windmill, freed from their restraints, caught a heavy gust of the afternoon thermal wind. Eleanor held her breath. Caleb's hand found hers on the railing, his long fingers wrapping tightly around her own. The blades turned. The red-hot sleeved shaft held fast. The relocated secondary gear ground against the crank with a harsh metallic screech that slowly smoothed into a deep, heavy clack. Clack groan, clack groan. It was faster than before. The gear ratio altered, but the teeth were holding. The pump rod plunged down into the earth, then rose again. Down in the yard, the men gathered around the large wooden collection trough. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then a violent shudder racked the iron pipe. A torrent of icy, crystal-clear water exploded from the spout, crashing into the dry wooden trough. The men erupted into deafening cheers, tossing their hats into the air and slapping each other on the back. The herd was saved. Blackwood was saved. Up on the platform, Caleb let out a breath that sounded like a laugh. He pulled Eleanor against him, wrapping his arms around her and burying his face in her hair. She hugged him back fiercely, her grease-stained hands clutching the damp fabric of his shirt, overwhelmed by a soaring sense of triumph. "We need to go down," Caleb murmured into her hair, though he didn't seem to want to let her go. "The pipe needs to be flushed." They climbed down the wooden ladder, greeted by the grinning faces of the ranch hands. Tom pumped Caleb's hand, then turned and took off his hat to Eleanor, bowing deeply. "Ma'am, I ain't never seen nothing like it. You've got the devil's own magic in those hands." "Just leverage, Mr. Higgins," Eleanor smiled, wiping her hands on a rag. Caleb walked over to the wooden trough, watching the water churn. Because the pump had been violently stopped and the suction interrupted, the water gushing from the pipe was temporarily dredging up sediment from the very bottom of the deep water well. The water sputtered, coughing up a thick slurry of gray mud and rust. With a sharp clink, something heavy and metallic shot out of the iron pipe, bouncing off the wooden edge of the trough and landing in the wet mud at Caleb's boots. Caleb frowned. He reached down and picked it up. It was a brass cylinder, heavily tarnished and crusted with years of mineral deposits, but its shape was unmistakable. Eleanor stepped closer, wiping her face. "What is it? A piece of the old pump valve?" Caleb didn't answer. He rubbed his thumb hard over the base of the cylinder, wiping away the dark muck to reveal the stamped primer. His face went entirely blank. The triumphant joy of the moment vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness that chilled Eleanor to the bone despite the 100-degree heat. "Caleb?" she asked softly. He held the object out in his massive palm. It wasn't a valve, it was a spent bullet casing. "It's a 50 to 90 sharps," Caleb whispered, his voice sounding like cracking ice. "A buffalo rifle round." Tom walked over, his face paling as he looked at the heavy brass casing. "Boss, your father's rifle was a .44 Winchester. He didn't own a Sharps." "No," Caleb said, his jaw locking so tight the muscles ticked. He slowly closed his fist around the casing, his knuckles turning white. His storm-gray eyes lifted, staring toward the eastern horizon, toward the Croft estate. "He didn't. But Harlan Croft's men do." Eleanor stared at the brass casing hidden in Caleb's fist, a sickening realization twisting in her stomach. 10 years ago, Caleb's father had been found dead at the bottom of this very well. The sheriff had ruled it a tragic accident. A man slipping in the dark while trying to fix the pump rope, his own rifle accidentally discharging in the fall. But a man doesn't accidentally shoot himself with a gun he doesn't own. It wasn't an accident, it was a murder. And the evidence had been buried under 300 feet of icy water, until Eleanor Vance altered the gears and dragged it into the light. The kerosene lamp cast a flickering golden circle over the scarred wooden table of the cookhouse. In the center of that light sat the rusted brass casing of the .50-90 Sharps. It was past midnight. The rest of the ranch had fallen into an exhausted, heavy sleep, lulled by the frantic, doubled rhythm of the sleeved windmill outside. Clack, groan. Clack, groan. It pumped like a racing heart, drawing the icy water that was currently saving the herd. But inside the cookhouse, the silence was suffocating. Caleb sat in the chair at the head of the table, his forearms resting on the wood, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the brass casing. He hadn't moved in an hour. He had scrubbed the grease and dirt from his face and changed his ruined shirt, but the physical toll of the day's brutal labor was etched into every line of his posture. Eleanor stood by the stove, watching the water in the iron kettle begin to simmer. She poured the hot water into an enamel basin, grabbed a clean cloth and a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey from the pantry, and carried them to the table. She set them down softly, the clink of glass against wood breaking Caleb's trance. He looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with ghosts that had haunted him for 10 years. Without a word, Eleanor pulled up a chair beside him. She reached out and gently took his right hand. Caleb flinched slightly, but he didn't pull away. His hands were a ruined landscape. The heavy sledgehammer and the sheer violent friction of shifting the massive iron gears had torn through his calluses. Deep, raw blisters wept clear fluid, and the skin across his knuckles was split and caked with dried blood. He had carved her a knife handle to save her hands, but he had shredded his own to save his father's legacy. Eleanor dipped the cloth into the warm water. "This will sting," she murmured. She uncorked the whiskey with her teeth and poured a generous splash into the basin, the sharp medicinal fumes rising into the quiet air. With meticulous feather-light precision, Eleanor began to clean the grease and blood from his torn skin. Her thumb braced against the uninjured part of his palm as she worked the cloth over his knuckles. Caleb's jaw clenched. The muscles in his forearm bunched tight as the alcohol bit into the open wounds, but he remained perfectly still, his massive frame submitting entirely to her care. "The sheriff said he slipped," Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse, staring at the brass casing instead of his bleeding hands. "Said he went out in the dark to fix a frayed rope. Slipped on the wet boards and struck his head on the iron base before he fell in. Ruled the gunshot a misfire from his own Winchester when it hit the ground." Eleanor rinsed the cloth, the water in the basin turning a murky rust pink. She gently took his left hand, beginning the painful process again. "I was 20, Caleb continued, the words spilling out like blood from an unbandaged wound. "I believed the law. I buried him. I took over the herd. And for 10 years Harlan Croft has come around, smiling, offering to buy the land my father died on, telling me it was a tragedy." A violent shudder racked Caleb's broad shoulders. The control he exerted over his horses, his men, and his own terrifying temper finally cracked. "He murdered him, Eleanor," Caleb choked out, the raw agony in his voice shattering the quiet room. "They shot him and threw him down his own well to drown." Eleanor dropped the cloth into the basin. She didn't offer hollow platitudes. She didn't tell him it would be all right, because nothing about it was all right. Instead, she moved her chair closer, the heavy wool of her skirt brushing against his denim trousers. She took both of his clean, ruined hands in hers, wrapping her small, calloused fingers around his massive palms. "We will take it to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne," Eleanor said fiercely, her voice a steady, unbreakable anchor. "Not the local sheriff, the federal marshal. We have the casing. We have the motive. You will get justice, Caleb." Caleb slowly turned his head to look at her. The distance between them was practically non-existent. In the golden lamplight, he saw the absolute unyielding loyalty in her eyes. This woman, who had been stripped of everything, abandoned at a train station and forced into brutal labor, was sitting here ready to go to war for him. A ragged breath escaped his chest. He turned his hands over, his torn palms gripping hers with a desperate, clinging strength. He didn't kiss her. He leaned forward, his broad shoulders bowing, and rested his forehead heavily against her shoulder. Eleanor's breath hitched. She froze for a fraction of a second, overwhelmed by the sheer, staggering vulnerability of the gesture. The strongest, most dangerous man she had ever known was hiding his face against her neck, his large frame trembling. Slowly, instinctively, she freed one of her hands and brought it up to his damp, dark hair. She stroked the back of his neck, her fingers sliding through the heavy strands, offering a silent, fierce comfort. "You gave me back his truth today," Caleb whispered against her collarbone, his voice thick with unshed tears. The heat of his breath seeped through the cotton of her dress, burning into her skin. "I was going to sell. I was going to let them win. You saved me, Eleanor. You saved everything." "You saved me first," she whispered back, her cheek resting against the top of his head. They stayed like that for a long time. The ticking of her pocket watch on the shelf perfectly matched the frantic, heavy beating of her own heart. The air in the cookhouse was thick with a profound, terrifying intimacy. A bond forged not in ballrooms or parlor games, but in grease, blood, and survival. When Caleb finally lifted his head, his storm-gray eyes were clear, burning with a lethal, focused resolve. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes, an unspoken promise hanging heavy in the space between them. "Tomorrow," Caleb said softly, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek, "I ride for Cheyenne, and when I come back and Croft is in chains, You and I are going to have a talk about the end of your 6 months." Eleanor's heart soared. "I'll pack you provisions at dawn." But tomorrow would bring a storm neither of them could fix with a wrench or a hammer. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern trail just as Eleanor was wrapping a block of hard cheese in wax paper for Caleb's saddlebags. It was mid-morning. Caleb was in the barn saddling his fastest gelding, the brass casing carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into his breast pocket. Tom Higgins was greasing the wagon wheels nearby. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch. The dust didn't belong to a pair of riders. It was a heavy, churning cloud kicked up by a polished black buggy, accompanied by 4 mounted men. Clack-groan, clack-groan. The windmill kept turning, entirely indifferent to the approaching threat. Caleb emerged from the barn, his Winchester rifle already in his hands. He didn't raise it, but his posture was rigid, his eyes narrowed against the glare. Tom limped up to stand beside him, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The buggy pulled into the yard, the fine thoroughbreds snorting in the heat. Harlan Croft sat in the driver's seat. Beside him sat a man wearing a crisp-tailored Eastern suit and a pristine bowler hat. Eleanor's blood ran instantly cold. The block of cheese slipped from her fingers, hitting the porch boards with a dull thud. It was Silas Montgomery. The 4 mounted men fanned out behind the buggy. Among them was Jasper Croft smirking, and a man wearing a tarnished silver star pinned to his vest, the Laramie County Sheriff. "Morning, Caleb," Harlan Croft called out cheerfully, securing the buggy's brake. He looked up at the furiously spinning blades of the windmill. "I see you managed a miracle with that broken gear. Astonishing what a desperate man can achieve." "Get off my land, Harlan," Caleb said, his voice a low, lethal warning. He racked the lever of the Winchester. The metallic clack echoed sharply. "Or they'll be burying you next to the gear you tried to break." The sheriff nudged his horse forward, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Put the rifle down, Caleb. Nobody's drawing iron today. I'm here on official county business." "Since when are you Croft's errand boy, Miller?" Caleb spat. "Since Mr. Croft's attorney presented me with federal documents," Sheriff Miller replied, gesturing toward the buggy. Silas Montgomery stepped down from the buggy, brushing a speck of dust from his tailored lapel. He didn't look at Caleb. His flat, pale blue eyes immediately found Eleanor standing paralyzed on the porch. A sickening, triumphant smile curved his lips. "Hello, Eleanor," Silas said smoothly. "I told you not to run." Eleanor couldn't breathe. Her hands gripped the wooden railing so hard splinters bit into her palms. Tick, tick, tick. Her mind raced, trying to find the mechanical logic to escape the trap, but the gears were jamming. "Who is this?" Caleb demanded, stepping between Silas and the porch, using his broad shoulders to block the lawyer's view of Eleanor. "Silas Montgomery, Esquire." Silas introduced himself with a mocking bow. "I represent Mr. Croft in all property acquisitions. But today, I am acting on behalf of the Boston Fidelity Bank." Silas pulled a thick sheaf of papers from his breast pocket and handed them to the sheriff. "This woman," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the yard, "is Eleanor Vance. She is a wanted fugitive. She fled the Commonwealth of Massachusetts after forging her late father's signature on over $4,000 worth of promissory notes." "That's a lie!" Eleanor screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. She stumbled down the porch steps. "He forged those notes. Silas engineered the loans after my father died to seize our shop." "A desperate fabrication from a desperate thief," Silas sighed, shaking his head. He looked at the sheriff. "The warrants are federally notarized, Sheriff Miller. Crossing state lines to flee financial ruin and commit fraud carries a mandatory sentence in the territorial prison." Sheriff Miller looked at the papers, then at Caleb. "The seals are real, Caleb. I have to take her in. She'll be held in Laramie until a federal marshal transfers her back east to face trial." Caleb's face went entirely white. He knew exactly what territorial prisons did to women. It was a death sentence of disease, brutality, and horror. He raised the Winchester, aiming it directly at Silas's chest. "She's not going anywhere." "Draw that rifle, Thorne, and my deputies will cut you down," the sheriff warned, drawing his own revolver. The three Croft men behind him leveled their rifles at Caleb. Tom Higgins drew his pistol, aiming at Jasper. "Stop!" Eleanor cried, running to stand in front of Caleb. She pressed her hands against the barrel of his rifle, pushing it down. "Caleb, please! If you shoot, they'll kill you. They'll kill Tom." Caleb looked down at her. His chest was heaving, his eyes wild with a terrifying cornered panic. He had a bullet casing in his pocket that could hang Harlan Croft, but if he died right now in a shootout, the truth would die with him, and Eleanor would be dragged off in chains. Harlan Croft chuckled, stepping down from the buggy. He walked up to Caleb, completely ignoring the guns drawn around them. "There is an elegant solution to this unfortunate mess, Caleb," Harlan said softly, pulling a folded legal deed from his coat. "Mr. Montgomery is a reasonable man. If his client's legal fees and the outstanding debts were compensated, I'm sure he could see his way to having the charges dropped and the warrants destroyed." Caleb's jaw locked. "You want the ranch." "I want the water," Harlan corrected. "Sign the deed to Blackwood over to me right now. In exchange, Miss Vance walks free. The sheriff goes home, and you and your men have until sundown to pack your saddles and ride out of the valley." The trap snapped shut. It was a masterpiece of extortion. If Caleb fought, he died and Eleanor went to prison. If he refused, Eleanor went to prison. The only way to save her was to surrender his father's legacy, the land he had bled for, and the water that kept the valley alive. "Caleb, no," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with horror as she realized the magnitude of the sacrifice. "Do not sign it. It's his land. He killed your father for it. You can't give it to him." Caleb looked at Harlan Croft. He looked at Silas Montgomery's smug, punchable face. And finally, he looked down at Eleanor. He saw the soot still smudged on her collar from yesterday's labor. He remembered the feel of her hands cleaning his wounds just hours ago. He knew she would rather go to a cholera-infested prison than see him lose his ranch. If he signed the paper out of love, she would refuse to let him do it. She would confess to the false crimes to save his land. There was only one way to make her leave safely. He had to break her heart. Caleb slowly lowered the Winchester. The wild panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, dead, terrifying emptiness. The man who had rested his head on her shoulder the night before was gone. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice echoing with flat, brutal apathy, "you don't need to arrest anyone, and I'm not signing a damn thing over a hired cook." Eleanor froze. "Caleb?" Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his eyes locked on Silas. "I hired her 3 weeks ago to scrub pots. If she's a wanted grifter, that's her problem, not mine. I'm not trading 3,000 acres of prime grazing land for a thief." Harlan Croft's smug smile faltered. Silas blinked, clearly taken aback by the sheer callousness of the rancher's pivot. "You're just going to hand her over?" Silas asked, suspicious. "I don't harbor criminals," Caleb spat. He finally turned to look at Eleanor. His storm-gray eyes were devoid of all warmth. They were flat, hard, and utterly ruthless. "I told you I didn't want weeping city girls," Caleb said, his voice loud enough for the entire yard to hear. Every word was a knife, precisely aimed to gut her. "I should have known better when you got off that train with nothing. You've been a liability since day one." Eleanor staggered back a step, as if he had physically struck her. The air vanished from her lungs. "Caleb, what are you doing?" "I'm firing you," Caleb said coldly. He reached into his vest, pulled out a heavy leather pouch of gold coins. His entire life savings, meant to buy winter feed, and shoved it violently against her chest. "Here's your wages. Get off my property." Eleanor clutched the heavy pouch, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The tears she had refused to shed at the Laramie station, finally welled in her eyes, blurring his face. "You don't mean this. Last night was a mistake. Caleb interrupted harshly, his jaw ticking. He turned his back on her. Tom, hitch the wagon. Hitch, take her to the station. If she sets foot on Blackwood again, shoot her. Tom Higgins stood paralyzed, his revolver hanging uselessly at his side. He looked at Caleb in sheer, uncomprehending horror. Boss, you can't be serious. Do it, Tom, Caleb roared, the terrifying volume of his voice making the horses jump. Tom flinched. He holstered his gun, his face grim, and walked toward the barn. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. Caleb, she still has federal warrants. I have to take her. She has money now, Caleb said, not turning around, staring at the windmill. A lot of it. I'm sure Montgomery can figure out a way to settle the debt without the paperwork. Silas looked at the heavy pouch in Eleanor's trembling hands. The greed in his eyes was unmistakable. He whispered something to Harlan Croft. Croft scowled but gave a curt nod. The goal had been the ranch, but taking the cash and removing the girl was an acceptable consolation prize. We will take the funds as a settlement, Silas announced smoothly. The warrants will be withdrawn. Eleanor couldn't hear him. The roaring in her ears drowned out the wind, the horses, and the smug voices of the men who had ruined her. Her world hadn't just collapsed. It had been obliterated by the very man she had rebuilt it with. Tom drove the buckboard up to the porch, his face averted in shame. He had already tossed her trunk into the back. Come on, ma'am, Tom whispered, his voice cracking. Eleanor turned. She didn't look at Silas. She didn't look at Croft. She looked at Caleb's broad back, wrapped in denim and stubborn, cruel silence. Tick, tick, tick. Her pocket watch kept time in the shattered ruins of her chest. She climbed into the wagon, clutching the pouch of gold. Tom cracked the reins and the heavy draft horses pulled them away from the cabin. As the wagon rolled down the dusty trail, Eleanor looked back one last time. The windmill was still turning. Clack groan, but Caleb Thorne was gone, vanished into the dark shadows of the barn, leaving her completely, utterly alone. The buckboard wagon rattled over the rutted trail toward Laramie. The silence between Eleanor and Tom Higgins thick and suffocating. Eleanor sat rigidly on the wooden bench, the heavy leather pouch of Caleb's life savings burning a hole through her wool skirt. Tick, tick, tick. Her pocket watch marked the miles, but her mind was a shattered mess of gears. I should have known better when you got off that train with nothing. You've been a liability since day one. His words played on a loop, each repetition driving the knife deeper. But as the shock began to recede, the cold, analytical mind of the watchmaker began to reassert itself. Mechanics relied on absolute consistency. A gear did not suddenly reverse its rotation without a catastrophic external force. Caleb Thorne was a man who had spent hours whittling a knife handle to save her blistered hands. He was a man who had rested his forehead against her shoulder in the dead of night, trusting her with his deepest grief. He had not fired her because he hated her. He had fired her because it was the only way Silas Montgomery would take the money and drop the federal warrants. Caleb had humiliated her in front of the entire county to ensure she would get on the train and never look back. He had sacrificed his pride, his savings, and his own heart to keep her out of a territorial prison. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the horrifying truth locked into place. If Caleb gave away all his capital to save her, he had nothing left to fight the Crofts. Silas and Harlan would simply wait for the bank to foreclose, or worse, they would return to Blackwood tonight and slaughter him while he was defenseless. Tom, Eleanor said, her voice startling the old foreman. Stop the wagon. Tom blinked, looking at her with hollow eyes. Ma'am, the boss gave me strict orders. I have to get you to the station and pay off that snake Montgomery before the 4 p.m. eastbound arrives. Tom, if you take me to that train, Caleb is a dead man by sunrise and you know it. Tom's jaw tightened. He pulled back on the reins, bringing the heavy draft horses to a halt in the dust. He looked out over the prairie, the lines in his weathered face deepening. The sky above them was rapidly changing. The oppressive heat of the morning was being swallowed by a massive, bruised wall of dark clouds rolling in from the north. A freak Wyoming blizzard was brewing, plunging the temperature by the minute. "What do you want me to do, Miss Vance?" Tom asked, his voice cracking. "Croft has the deed. Silas has the law." "Silas has a forged warrant and Croft has a county deed," Eleanor corrected, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the distant smudge of Laramie. "But Caleb's well taps into a subterranean river. Water that deep doesn't belong to the county. It belongs to the federal government." Tom frowned. "How do you know that?" "Because my father built chronometers for the U.S. Geological Survey. I read their maps," Eleanor said, grabbing the reins from Tom's hands. "We aren't going to the train station. We're going to the Federal Land Office. And then we are going to the U.S. Marshal." When they reached Laramie, the first fat flakes of snow were already falling, swirling viciously in the dropping wind. The county land office was closed for the weekend, its heavy oak door locked tight. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She pulled a slim steel tension wrench from her tool roll, knelt before the brass keyhole, and picked the lock in under 40 seconds. Inside, the air smelled of dust, dry ink, and rotting paper. For 2 agonizing hours, while the blizzard began to howl outside, Eleanor and Tom tore through mountains of leather-bound ledgers and rolled canvas maps. "Here!" Eleanor cried, unrolling a heavy yellowed topographical map of the Laramie Basin dated 1868. She traced her finger along a blue line marked Deep Aquifer 4A. It ran directly under the coordinates for Blackwood Ranch. Stamped in stark red ink across the bottom of the map was the seal of the federal government. Protected interstate waterway, exempt from county seizure or foreclosure. Harlan Croft's mortgage on Blackwood only covered the surface dirt. He had no legal right to the water, and without the water the deed was utterly worthless to his empire. Eleanor rolled the map tightly, her heart hammering a triumphant rhythm. "Tom, to the marshal's office." They burst through the doors of the U.S. Marshal's outpost just as the blizzard hit full force, rattling the window panes. Marshal Davies, a hard-eyed man with a silver star and a shotgun resting on his desk, stood up in alarm as Tom and a snow-covered Eleanor rushed in. Eleanor didn't give him time to speak. She slammed the heavy pouch of gold, the topographical map, and the oilcloth-wrapped .50-90 Sharps casing onto his desk. "Marshal," Eleanor breathed, her eyes blazing with absolute defiance. "I am Eleanor Vance. Silas Montgomery has a forged county warrant for my arrest, and Harlan Croft is currently attempting to murder a rancher named Caleb Thorne to cover up a 10-year-old homicide. We need to ride, now." 30 miles away, Blackwood Ranch was swallowed in whiteout conditions. Caleb Thorne stood alone on the front porch of the main cabin, the Winchester rifle resting loose in his hands. The wind screamed through the yard, driving the freezing snow into his skin, but he didn't feel the cold. The agonizing, hollow emptiness in his chest had consumed everything else. She was gone. She was safe, sitting on a plush velvet seat of an eastbound train, far away from the dirt, the blood, and the cruelty of Wyoming. That was all that mattered. Through the blinding snow, shadowy figures materialized at the edge of the yard. Harlan Croft, Jasper, and 6 hired guns rode their horses through the drifts, their rifles drawn. They hadn't waited for the bank to foreclose. They had come to finish the job under the cover of the storm. "It's over, Caleb." Harlan's voice was barely audible over the howling wind. "You have no money, you have no men. Walk away, and we'll let you freeze on the trail instead of shooting you where you stand." Caleb slowly raised the Winchester to his shoulder. He thumbed the hammer back. He was going to die on this porch, just as his father had died in the mud of the well. But he would drag Harlan Croft to hell with him. Before Caleb could pull the trigger, a massive, thunderous roar echoed from the southern trail. A heavy stagecoach, commandeered and driven by Tom Higgins, smashed through the snowdrifts, pulled by 4 terrified, lathered horses. Flanking the coach were U.S. Marshal Davies and 4 federal deputies, their badges catching the faint light from Caleb's porch. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons!" Davies bellowed over the storm, racking his shotgun. Croft's hired guns took one look at the federal deputies and immediately dropped their rifles into the snow, raising their hands. Harlan Croft's face twisted in pure, unadulterated shock as Marshal Davies rode his horse directly up to him, leveling the shotgun at the older man's chest. "Harlan Croft, you are under federal arrest for the murder of Elias Thorne, extortion, and attempting to seize federal waterways," the marshal declared. He glanced at Jasper. "And you're coming too, boy." Caleb lowered his rifle, his mind struggling to process the chaotic scene. The door to the stagecoach swung open. Eleanor stepped out into the blizzard. She was shivering, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks with snow, but she walked through the freezing gale with the unshakable posture of a queen returning to her kingdom. Caleb dropped the Winchester. It hit the porch boards with a clatter. He vaulted over the wooden railing, his boots hitting the deep snow, and ran toward her. He didn't care who was watching. He crashed into her, pulling her small, freezing body against his chest, wrapping his arms around her so tightly he lifted her off her feet. "You didn't get on the train," Caleb choked out, burying his face in her snowy neck, his massive frame trembling violently. "Eleanor, God, you were supposed to leave." "I am the bookkeeper of Blackwood Ranch, Caleb Thorne," Eleanor whispered fiercely against his ear, her arms locking around his neck. "And I do not abandon my ledgers." An hour later, the Crofts were riding back to Laramie in federal irons. The cookhouse was warm, the heavy Acme stove roaring with a fresh fire. Tom and the hands were in the bunkhouse, leaving Caleb and Eleanor entirely alone. Eleanor stood by the stove, a wool blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders. She watched as Caleb paced the floor, running his hands through his dark hair. The sheer relief in the room was palpable, but there was still a heavy, unspoken truth resting between them. "You gave me everything you had," Eleanor said softly, breaking the silence. "You let me believe you hated me, just to keep me out of a cell." Caleb stopped pacing. He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes stripping away the last of his armor. "I would have given them my life if it meant you got to walk away. I'm sorry I said those things to you. I'm sorry I hurt you." Eleanor stepped closer to the table. As she did, her eye caught something inside Caleb's small desk in the corner. In his frantic rush to find his gold pouch earlier that day, a hidden drawer had been left slightly ajar. Inside the drawer was a neat stack of yellow telegrams. Eleanor frowned. She reached out and pulled the top telegram from the stack. It was dated 3 days before her arrival in Laramie. It was addressed to Silas Montgomery, care of Harlan Croft. "The Vance girl boarded the train in Boston. As instructed, I will abandon her at the station. The debt forgery is complete. You owe me $50. As Eleanor's breath hitched, she flipped to the next one, intercepted by the local telegraph operator and clearly passed to Caleb. It outlined the entire scam. She turned to face him, the telegram trembling in her hand. You knew Silas was going to abandon me before I ever arrived." Caleb closed his eyes, a heavy sigh escaping his chest. "Yes, you weren't just passing by the station that day," Eleanor whispered, the pieces finally clicking into their perfect final places. "You were waiting for me." Caleb stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He gently took the telegram from her hand and tossed it onto the table. "I heard the men at the saloon laughing about Silas's plan to ruin an Eastern bride," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a rough, vulnerable rasp. "I went to the station intending to give you a ticket back to Boston, to save a victim." He reached up, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. "But then I saw you," Caleb whispered, his eyes blazing with absolute devotion. "I watched your trunk fall open. I watched the crowd laugh at you. And I watched you refuse to shed a single tear. You didn't break, Eleanor. You just packed your things and stood your ground." Eleanor's eyes filled with hot, sudden tears. "I didn't step forward out of pity," Caleb swore, his voice fierce and unwavering. "I stepped forward because I realized I wasn't looking at a victim. I was looking at an equal. I was looking at the only woman in the world strong enough to stand beside me in this hellhole and turn it into a home." He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers in the warm, quiet space. I waited for you my whole life, he whispered. Eleanor let out a shattered, joyous sob. She dropped her blanket, throwing her arms around his neck, and pulled him down to her. The kiss was desperate, fierce, and entirely consuming. It tasted of salt, snow, and salvation. It was the collision of two people who had been violently broken by the world, only to find that their jagged edges fit together perfectly. Caleb wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her flush against his chest, holding her as if he would never, ever let her go. Outside, the windmill turned steadily through the storm. Clack groan, clack groan. It was no longer a sound of survival. It was a heartbeat. The Wyoming spring arrived not with a gentle whisper, but with a sudden, violent burst of life. The snowmelt flooded the dry creeks, turning the sprawling plains of the Laramie Basin into a brilliant, breathtaking ocean of emerald green. At Blackwood Ranch, the air smelled of wet earth, sweet sage, and fresh pine. There were no gilded invitations, no silk ribbons, and no high society gossip. The guests consisted of 10 rough-handed cowboys, a federal marshal who had ridden out just for the occasion, and Tom Higgins, who had spent 3 days meticulously scrubbing the dirt from his only Sunday suit. They gathered in the yard, directly beneath the towering iron structure of the windmill. Eleanor stood on the porch, looking down at her hands. The deep blisters had healed, leaving behind smooth, permanent calluses. She wore the same dark blue wool dress she had arrived in 6 months ago. She hadn't bought a wedding gown. Instead, she had spent her evenings carefully mending the frayed hem and replacing the worn buttons with polished brass. It was the dress of a survivor, and she wore it like armor. Tick, tick, tick. Her father's silver pocket watch was pinned securely over her heart. The cookhouse door opened and Tom limped out. He stopped, his weathered face softening into a remarkably tender smile. He held out his arm. "You look beautiful, Miss Eleanor," Tom said gruffly, clearing a sudden thickness from his throat. "It is the greatest honor of my life to walk you down those steps." "The honor is mine, Tom," Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining as she looped her arm through his. They walked down the wooden steps and into the sun-drenched yard. The men removed their hats, falling into a respectful, silent reverence. But Eleanor only saw one man. Caleb stood at the base of the windmill. He wore a clean, dark suit that stretched tight across his broad shoulders, his dark hair neatly combed, though the jagged scar on his brow remained a testament to the life he had fought for. When he saw her, the breath visibly left his lungs. The harsh, guarded rancher who had threatened her with a life of hard labor was entirely gone. In his place stood a man looking at his absolute salvation. Tom led her to Caleb, gently placing her calloused hand into Caleb's massive, scarred palm. Caleb's fingers curled around hers, anchoring her, his thumb stroking her knuckles. A circuit-riding preacher from Cheyenne stepped forward, holding a worn, leather-bound Bible. "We are gathered here today, in the sight of God and the open sky, to join this man and this woman." Eleanor didn't hear the rest of the traditional sermon. The roaring wind and the rhythmic clack groan of the windmill above them drowned out the polite words. But she didn't need to hear them. The promises had already been made in the quiet dark of the cookhouse, over bloodied hands and shared burdens. "Do you, Caleb Thorne, take this woman?" "I do," Caleb said, his voice a deep, resonant vow that carried across the plains. He didn't look at the preacher. He kept his storm-gray eyes locked entirely on Eleanor. "And do you, Eleanor Vance, take this man?" "I do," she replied, her voice steady and clear, ringing with the absolute certainty of a perfectly calibrated gear. Caleb reached into his vest pocket. He didn't pull out a diamond. He pulled out a simple, thick band of plain gold, forged from the very coins he had once shoved into her hands to save her life. He slid the ring onto her finger. It slid perfectly over her calluses, catching the bright Wyoming sun. "I pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher smiled. "You may kiss the bride." Caleb didn't hesitate. He pulled her flush against his chest, one hand wrapping around her waist, the other tangling in the dark hair at the nape of her neck. He kissed her with a fierce, branding possession, pouring every ounce of his gratitude, his reverence, and his love into her. The ranch hands erupted. 10 Stetson hats flew into the blue sky, accompanied by deafening, joyous whoops, and the sharp, celebratory cracks of revolver fire echoing off the distant mountains. Eleanor laughed against his mouth, wrapping her arms around his neck. They had built this. Out of dust, betrayal, and broken iron, they had built a machine that could not be stopped. 10 years later. The scent of roasting beef and fresh-baked sourdough filled the warm, sunlit expanse of the expanded Blackwood cookhouse. Eleanor Thorne stood at the heavy wooden table, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. At 36, the harsh Wyoming sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, but she had never looked more vibrant. The simple gold band on her left hand was scratched and dull from a decade of relentless labor, and she wouldn't have traded it for the crown jewels of England. "Mama, it won't catch." Eleanor turned. Sitting at the far end of the kitchen table was her 8-year-old daughter, Abigail. The little girl had Caleb's dark hair and Eleanor's fierce, calculating eyes. Scattered across the table in front of her were the dismantled brass components of a broken pocket watch. Eleanor walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. She leaned down, inspecting the intricate puzzle of gears. "You're trying to force the escape wheel, Abby," Eleanor said gently, tapping a small, jagged brass gear with her fingernail. "Look at the teeth. If you force it against the pallet fork before they are aligned, you'll snap the pivot. It requires patience, not power. Find the balance first." Balance. Abigail frowned in deep concentration. She picked up a pair of tweezers, took a slow breath, and gently nudged the tiny wheel. With a soft, almost imperceptible click, the gear seated perfectly into place. "I did it," Abigail beamed, looking up at her mother. "You did," a deep, rumbling voice echoed from the doorway. Eleanor smiled, her heart giving that same familiar flutter it had possessed for 10 years. Caleb stepped into the kitchen. He was 42 now, the silver heavily dusting his temples, the lines of his face deeper, more weathered. But his shoulders were just as broad, his presence just as immovable. He carried the scent of pine, leather, and the crisp autumn air. He walked over, dropping a kiss onto the top of Abigail's head, ruffling her dark hair. "Your grandfather would be proud, little bird. Go wash up for supper. Tell Tom to ring the bell." "Yes, Papa." Abigail scrambled out of her chair and darted out the back door, her boots thumping loudly against the porch boards. Caleb watched her go, a soft, profound warmth in his gray eyes. Then he turned to his wife. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped behind her, wrapping his massive, scarred arms around her waist, and pulled her back flush against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, letting out a long, contented sigh. Eleanor leaned back into his embrace, her hands coming up to rest over his thick forearms. She traced the faded white scars on his knuckles, the scars he had earned saving the windmill, saving her, saving them. Together they looked out the large glass window over the sink. The Blackwood yard was a sprawling testament to their survival. New barns had been raised, the bunkhouses were full. The herd was 10,000 strong, grazing on miles of federal land that the Crofts, who had both died in a territorial prison years ago, could never touch. And standing tall against the painted twilight sky was the iron windmill. It was rusted in places, weathered by a decade of blizzards and droughts, but the blades turned with a smooth, unstoppable grace. "Tom says the western fence line is secure," Caleb murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. "We're ready for the winter." "We are," Eleanor agreed softly, turning her head to press a kiss to his jaw. Caleb turned her in his arms, looking down at her with the same intense, burning devotion he had possessed on the day he married her. He reached up, his rough thumb tracing her cheekbone. 10 years, Caleb whispered, and you still run this place like a Swiss watch. A watch is nothing without the mainspring to give it power, Caleb, Eleanor smiled, resting her hands flat against the steady, heavy beating of his heart. We built it together. True love, Eleanor knew, was not a photograph in an envelope, nor a promise written in ink. It was the calluses on your hands. It was the grease on your brow. It was finding the person who would stand beside you in the blistering heat and the freezing snow, holding the heavy iron steady while you drove the pin home. Caleb lowered his head, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss that tasted of home, of victory, and of a lifetime of chosen love. From the porch, the heavy iron supper bell began to ring, calling their family home. And outside the window, the machines kept time. Tick, 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 clack, groan, clack, groan, clack, groan. Two completely different worlds, perfectly, beautifully synchronized. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.